Welcome to Fluid Ride Like a Pro. I'm Simon Lawton.
And I'm Lars Sternberg.
We're here in beautiful Port Angeles today, riding some great trails. The things we're going to be talking about today are going to benefit all riders of all disciplines. Let's go have some fun. The first skill, and most important, probably the base layer I would say of the pyramid, is braking. I mean, without being able to control your bicycle properly, without being able to come to a stop safely, you're really not going to feel comfortable on the bicycle. And once you feel like you have control over the bicycle, you're going to be a lot more comfortable, you're going to be able to relax, and you're going to be able to perform better. When brake modulation is occurring, your tires are turning at the speed or maybe just slightly below the speed that the ground is moving past your bicycle. And what I mean by that is it's almost as if you're about to start to skid. Your bicycle is trying to stop as quickly as it can, and you're just on that edge of your tires actually moving a little slower than the ground is going. So you're really pushing to get as much out of your brakes as you possibly can without creating skidding. And in general, for less experienced riders, the thing I teach them is that you're never going to ride on with just your front brake in any situation. There are very few rare situations where you'll be just on your back brake, but always when we're braking, and this is something that most people don't think about because your brain kind of does it for you, you're always going to get on the front brake or the back brake a little bit first, move into the front brake, release the front brake, and then be off the back brake. So your front brake is never on by itself. It's a really important thing because it'll drag the front end of your bike down or pull you through a turn or something.
I would definitely say the modulation is the last instant before, using the full power of your brakes, but keeping it to the last instant before you're actually skidding.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's kind of maybe even gone a little bit too far in with the technology. I mean, we have brakes that are so powerful now that I see a lot of riders who maybe, they could probably get a lot more out of a brake that has a little bit less power, even because they can get their hands into it. They don't have to be so sensitive to it. And a lot of people just automatically gravitate toward the most powerful brake, the biggest, baddest, newest brake on the market. And I think that unless you have really sensitive use of your hands and a lot of experience, a lot of times that can actually lead you down the wrong road a little bit. So kind of thinking about how you brake, how well you use your hands. If you have a tendency to skid a lot, maybe it's time for a set of brakes that's not just overkill.
Yeah, one of the best ways to learn how to modulate is go run your fingers along your brake rotor and get them all greasy, and then you can. No, just kidding. When you're in the molache, so to speak, you can be a bit more aggressive with your brakes, because your tires are gonna get better traction. You're gonna be able to come in a bit hotter to certain obstacles. And brake later, and brake harder.
Yeah.
Whereas, say, when you're in sandy or dry and dusty conditions, or when you're in kind of a loose, gravelly sort of condition, or especially in the wet, you're gonna need to do a bit more modulating, than you would somewhere else, and that's just being lighter on the brakes, especially if it's wet and there's some roots or something before a turn. You're going to want to get your braking done before you get onto that section of roots, because you're going to want as much traction as you can get.
Yeah, and that's something we refer to at Fluid Ride. We refer to that as selective braking. Basically, selective braking involves is usually done on days where the conditions aren't perfect. And sometimes you might brake in a place before you normally brake, and then just have to let off the brakes to get over something slippery, maybe a slab of rock or some roots or things like that. So in those situations where it's really slippery, you're actually looking for zones that I call safety zones, places where you can actually slow your bicycle down a little bit before the next section.
This also works hand in hand with selective braking in good conditions. If you can stay a lot more in control if you have a section of trail with different undulations and turns and obstacles. If you brake in a couple key areas, whereas as opposed to just dragging the brakes, all the way down, or say getting into a situation where you get out of control and you just lock up the rear brake or the front brake or whatever, and that's going to either lead to a complete loss of control and crashing or one thing or another. So
after we teach proper modulation and show people how to stop, we start taking a look at their body and what's going on with it. Basically, when you put on the brakes on a bicycle, even on flat ground, it's going to pull your body forward into the bicycle. And that's going to really show me a lot about how the person deals with that force.
Be aware of what those forces are going to want to do to you or cause your body to do.
Well, like Lars is saying, you want to be ready to feel that pressure of the bicycle pushing you into it effectively. And you want to be ready to kind of fend that off and just be ready to firm up a little bit. But you want to stay away from completely premeditating it to where you think, oh man, last time I had this bad experience, I'm going to push my bike away before I grab my brakes. And that's something that I see in beginner riders or even intermediate riders a lot. And it really leads to a loss of control, kind of pushing their bicycle out before they grab the brakes, knowing that's going to push them toward them. So we want to premeditate more kind of mentally and just know that, but we want to know what it's going to feel like when we grab our brakes and be able to adjust our human suspension into that feeling of progressive braking, but not push the bicycle away in anticipation. So one of the important factors with body position is that we want to keep our elbows out. If we tuck our elbows in too much and grab the brakes, we're going to get pushed forward through the shoulders and through the front of the bike, which is a really dangerous position to be in. We've all felt that before, that pressure of the heel pushing us forward into our bicycle. What we actually want to do is we want to put our hands on the handlebars in such a way that the bar is going to run at a diagonal angle through our hand like this, and it's going to bring our elbows out by bringing that palm out toward the edge of the handlebar. Another important thing is going to be the way Lars holds his knees. If he's too stiff-legged or if he brings his knees in too close to the frame and gets what I call knock-kneed, then he's not going to be able to bend properly at the knees or at the hips, and that's going to cause his lower back to bend, cause him to stoop, and cause his head to come down when he's braking, which is going to basically create an imbalance in his inner ear, as well as making it less easy to see the trail ahead of him. So knees bent, knees out just slightly, elbows out, and chin up, good riding position like that. It's going to put Lars in a great position coming down a hill to fend off the forces of gravity. Another thing that's important is our foot position on the pedals. We want to make sure that our feet are either flat, or if we're descending down steep terrain, that our heels are tipped back slightly. As soon as I get tipped forward over the pedal spindle too much, everything else is going to fall apart. Basically, I'm going to put too much pressure into my body, I'm going to end up bending at the back, and I'm going to end up kind of hunched over and feel like I'm pushing through the handlebars too much. Basically, yeah, elbows out, knees out a little bit, being in that position so that my body can push down through the suspension into the tires and create control. And only by being in that position is my head going to be able to be up and be balanced. The other thing you're going to hear me talk about today is riding inside the bicycle and riding inside our body. And this is one of the places where we're really going to take a look at that. Now what I mean by that is as I'm braking, I want to be sure that I'm moving down into my own human suspension. So what I want to do when I'm stopping here is effectively trap the whole bicycle down, trap my body down, have a situation where now the bicycle suspension, both front and rear, is compressed, so it also has positive and negative travel. My human suspension is compressed, so I have positive and negative travel. That's going to give me a lot of recourse when I'm stopping. Like that. So now I could feel my rear suspension compressing, I could feel my front suspension compressing, I could feel my body evenly compressing, and I wasn't in a position where I got pushed forward. When I get pushed forward like that, another thing happens. As I get pushed forward into my shoulders and my head comes down, I'm now bending at my back. I cannot squat now. Good. It's really important that when I'm stopping that I don't straighten my knees completely or straighten my elbows, because now I'm, again, another term you're going to hear a lot, at the end of my rope. So if I'm at the end of my rope and I'm braking here, it's fine, I can take in braking forces, but what happens if my front tire starts to slide? I've got nothing left to give. Same thing with my legs. My legs are in a bad position to move in both directions. Good. Now both you guys look pretty good on your bicycles, but we can definitely make a few changes that are going to help out a lot. Tristan, a little bit of what I'm seeing is as you're braking hard, you're standing a little bit tall on your legs, and it's knocking you a little bit into your shoulders, okay? First time you were losing your modulation because your shoulders were pulling the back tire off the ground.
And that's when my skidding was happening.
That's when your skidding was happening. And now you take that and you put that on a steeper hill, and you're probably skidding more than you really think. And that's all leading into a feeling of loss of control. Good, good. Try and bring your knees out just a little bit, and that'll help you bring your chin up. come toward a little more quickly and let that braking help bring you down like a cat. Almost like if you're playing tug of war with a dog with a rope, how they kind of dig in. So as you're feeling that braking, let that braking bring you down in your stance. Good, good, excellent. Much better, yes, much better. Now your hips are rolling out. Like at the end of that, as you're moving down, your hips were rolling out. Your head was up, your body's in the right position, you're compressing both tires, you're compressing both ends of the suspension. That's exactly what we're looking for. Let's talk about rolling down steep descents. One of the most common misconceptions about riding down a steep descent is that the rider simply has to shift his butt back. I want to refrain from doing this, and instead of being premeditative about the way I approach a steep hill, I want to let the hill tell me a bit more about itself. So I'm just going to maintain my neutral position and let the hill put me in position. The bottom bracket allows the rest of the bicycle to revolve around it. And having that stable plane allows me to know that my feet are stable and safe. I often visualize a magic carpet here around my pedals with two locations where my feet are firmly embedded. My feet will simply float on that magic carpet down the terrain, and the bicycle will jockey underneath me. Well, we talked a little bit about body position with the various parts of our body and the importance of utilizing our human suspension correctly. And one of the things that I want to touch on briefly is the way that our elbows work. And there have been some changes in recent years with the way people hold themselves on the bicycle, the people who are most successful, especially in elite downhill racing. When I talk about having my elbows out, I don't want to just have them out and anywhere like, up high like this where I'm going to push a lot of pressure into my shoulders. The idea is that I want to get my elbows out but hold them relatively flat. It's more like bouncing a basketball, the same kind of pressure it would take to bounce a basketball. As soon as I bring my elbows up and that bike comes into me, it's more like doing a push-up. So a lot of riders are doing a lot of extra work. It's particularly tough for tall guys to get into a position like that, but it is possible. It takes a lot of work, a lot of strength in the lower body to stand in that position, especially for long periods of time like a full downhill run, but very effective. If you can get your elbows from maybe being up here and kind of grabbing the handlebars too tightly to just relaxing a little bit and keeping your elbows a little bit lower. It's just going to take a lot of direct pressure out of your chest and shoulders and let the bike do the work. Let the suspension of the bicycle do the work. Let that bicycle jockey like a horse underneath you. We're going to talk for a minute about something that I call being at the end of your rope. When we're riding, as we've talked about, it's really important that we stay dynamic and stay within our body movement and our bicycle movement. We want to stay in a position that's neutral and allows us to move in both directions, allowing both for positive and negative travel from both our bicycle and our body. What I mean by this is, as we've talked about, when our suspension is squatted down and we're down inside our bicycle, we have both positive and negative travel. What we're going to talk about now is the human aspect of this, which is our arm movement and our leg movement. We're going to talk about keeping our elbows and our knees slightly bent while riding and resisting getting to what I call being at the end of your rope. What does that mean to be at the end of your rope? What it means is that I'm in a situation where either my legs have completely straightened or my arms have completely straightened prematurely for the terrain that I'm on. Obviously, with a dynamic sport like downhill mountain biking or free ride or any kind of mountain biking, we're going to have moments where our knees are straight or where our elbows are straight. But we want to make sure that they're exactly that, just brief moments and not long periods of time. One of the tendencies of a less experienced rider at the top of a steep hill is to push the bicycle away and get their butt back behind the saddle. We talked about this earlier, and we decided that this probably wasn't the best thing to do since the bicycle knows where we should be, and we should be waiting for it to tip down the hill and put us in position. If I premeditate too much and I push and get my butt back before I get to a steep hill, and my bicycle now rolls in, you can see what I've done. I've lost my human suspension right here. My elbows are no longer bending. Likely my weight is too far back, and my knees are also going to be in a stiff position, and now I'm going to be put in a position of just resisting the bicycle and just trying not to crash. So I want to let the bicycle come toward me a little bit, even on a steep descent, and as I go over steep parts, I might get to where my elbows and knees are straight, but only in anticipation of a terrain feature that's going to push the bicycle back into me. So I'm never at the end for very long. I always want to be moving back and forth and keeping dynamic. As with just about anything in mountain biking, there are exceptions to just about every rule. But we're going to talk about turning a little bit. There are a couple different theories about turning. Some people teach to always keep your feet level, basically if you had a clock at 3 and 9 o'clock. We're going to talk a little bit about using pressure into your pedals to create pressure through your suspension and into your tires. And some of the time that's going to require us to be in a position where we're at 6 and 12, where we have our outside foot pressuring directly down through into the ground and creating basically directional points of pressure straight into the ground. There are obviously going to be times where we're going to have our feet in a different position just because of the terrain, but in general on flatland turns, we want to force that outside foot down. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is it puts us in a better position to swing our inside knee in and look for the inside of the apex of the turn, and gives us a cue to start turning around that inside knee. The other thing is a lot of people ride flat pedals these days. So if you want to take your foot off because you have flat pedals, it's a nice advantage that you have riding flat pedals. Well, if your feet are always set at 3 and 9 and not at 6 and 12, when you take your foot off, what's going to happen? Outside pedal is going to go down, it's going to throw your weight off a little bit. So in general, on long radius turns or turns with a really tight radius, we're going to be more likely to actually get our outside foot all the way down to the 6 o'clock position.
Unless you're on a full off camber turn or something, you're not going to be all the way down consciously. Mm-hmm. You're going to be just using the pivot of your bottom bracket to get your, to get that traction and use that leverage.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. And there's something that we teach at Fluid Ride that we call dipping. And basically what that concept is just what Lars talked about. If I'm riding along and I'm pressuring with my feet set even, and instead of maybe bringing one foot, all the way down to the bottom, or the other foot all the way down to the bottom, we're almost always going to dip a little bit. And if you slow a video down of almost any elite racer, you might think their feet are level, but really slow the video down. And when you see right at the apex of that turn, watch their foot. That inside foot's going to come up a little bit, and that outside foot's going to go down just for an instant, because what that does is it takes my knees from being level, and just for an instant, it brings my inside knee up, and it gives me something to fall around, something to commit into the turn. If my knees are just level the whole time, I'm steering instead of falling into the turn and actually cornering or carving a turn. So we have to do something that cues our body to get into an athletic position, and that's either going to be getting that outside foot down or just dipping slightly with that outside foot for a moment. One of the things that we want to really think about and start to really be cognizant of is what we're trying to do with our bicycle when we're cornering. We're trying to push our bicycle into the terrain that we're riding on, and we're trying to press it down into that terrain and create the situation that we talked about when we were braking, where we're riding inside our bicycles. And what I mean by that is we want to be pressuring the bicycle to the point where we're creating some sag into the suspension, or if we don't have suspension, we're creating some compression into the tires of the bicycle, and that's going to be our suspension in that instance. And we're giving ourselves both positive and negative travel, so that if I'm coming through a turn, I can absorb bumps still, or if I hit a little washboard or a hole in the trail, I can also fill that in with my suspension's travel.
What would you say would be the fundamental turn or the fundamental turning technique?
I think flatland turns are probably the most fundamental. Most fundamental turn you could do, and I think probably the most overlooked turn, even at a pro level, mm-hmm. because you're so likely to concentrate on this rock garden or this double, or
right.
Something that really grabs your attention because it brings fear or some sort of uncomfortable feeling to you, and so you really want to conquer that. And really, in watching races and having seen a lot of racers and races, I think a lot of races are won and lost on the more simple sections that are often overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think having that core ability to really just rail a flatland turn is going to not only make you faster through flatland turns, it's going to bring a lot of speed to your other turns as well. Obviously, with a flatland turn, maybe other than an off-camber turn, it's probably going to be your most difficult turn. You're going to have a lot easier time when you have some backing, when you have a berm
right.
behind you. So yeah, teaching flatland turns, I think, is really at the essence of turning, because you don't have that crutch. And so you really need to look to those physical cues that a rider is using to bring themselves through the turn. Are they bringing their inside knee in and then turning their head, shoulders, and hips to follow? Are they doing all those things? On a berm, you might not notice if they're doing that because you can just kind of, just sit on top of your bicycle. And,
right.
and
You got to get that inside corner edge of the tire to
exactly.
dig in, as opposed to
just sitting on top of the flat part of the knobby.
Mountain biking traditionally takes place in a pretty three-dimensional environment. Because of that, unlike a road motorcycle rider, I'm not going to be leaning my body and the bicycle at the same time. If I were to do this, I would inevitably hit something loose on the ground that would cause my bicycle to slide out. Because of that, I want to pressure my inside row of knobbies into the ground. In order to do that, I'm going to lean the bicycle, but not the rider on a flatland turn. This is going to ensure that I'm driving my point of traction straight down into the ground where the traction is provided, pushing the inside row of knobbies into the ground squarely. This is going to be achieved through hip flexion. Because I'm leaning the bicycle and not the rider, the rider must bend in some place, and that's going to occur at the hip. As I bend at the hip, I still maintain a lot of positive pressure through my hip and my up hand to put into the suspension to create control. This control causes me to be able to ride inside the bicycle in a state where my suspension is partially compressed. I want to ride inside the bicycle so that I have control for bumps that come at me, but also for holes or any sort of roots or things in the trail where my suspension needs to come back out to find the ground.
One of the most important things that we can do is to create a situation where our body is upright but our bicycle is turning. If you think about it, if I take my bicycle and my body and I start to lean over, what's happening to my arrows? They're no longer driving straight down into the ground. They're driving out, and at some point they're going to diffract off the ground. Out goes my bike and down I go. So if I'm going to come through a flatland turn properly, I'm going to have to bend somewhere in order to keep my body relatively upright. Sure, I'm going to lean into the turn a little bit, but at some point, if I lean too far, the bike's gone. So I have to create a hinge, and that hinge is going to be created at my hip. When I'm coming into a corner, there's a moment at which I'm going to go from coming down the trail to actually executing a turn. And I want to make sure that at that moment that I put all my potential energy, all of my speed, all of my weight coming down the trail into my bicycle to create positive control. Now, when I do that, basically what I'm doing is loading a lot of pressure into my outside leg, particularly my outside quad. And that has really two very helpful components to it, one of which is control. I've got a lot of pressure into my outside foot, which is making my knobby bite into the ground more effectively. But even more than that, I'm creating a lot of positive energy, a lot of potential energy into my outside quad. And as I get through the apex of that turn, I'm just kind of going to let that energy just drain out of that outside leg, and that's going to propel me forward.
You can notice that sometimes if you see somebody hit a small turn really hard, they almost kind of jump out of it. You know, that's on a on a sharper one. That's basically the releasing of that tension to cause acceleration.
If I come into a turn and I'm not really pushing very hard, I'm going to have to work pretty hard to get through that turn. But if I've pushed hard, I've created a lot of positive pressure into my outside leg and into my suspension, I'm almost going to get a free moment going from one turn to the next where I almost don't even have contact with the ground or the potential to make a mistake. The way we do an off-camber turn is going to be very similar to the way we do a flatland turn, with a couple of notable exceptions. One of the things that we're going to concentrate on with an off-camber turn is to keep a little bit more bend in our outside knee. This is because the bicycle is more likely to slide down and away from us. So we want to have more of that negative travel with our leg to be able to extend out and make up for a situation like that. The other thing we're going to do is, in addition to looking where we want to go as we enter the turn and looking through the turn, we're going to keep our chin pointed just slightly uphill from where we normally would on a flatland turn, just to offset the effects that the hill is going to have wanting to kind of pull us off of it. So we're just going to turn our chin just a couple of degrees in toward the uphill side of the slope. We've talked about the arrows on a flatland turn being pointed directly into the ground. Now we've got a situation where the ground is sloping away from us. So the other thing we're going to have to exaggerate a little bit is getting our hip up over the bicycle to pressure straight down into the ground. So we're going to basically utilize a little bit more hip flexion than we did on the flatland turn.
What do you think is a good example of a turn where it's perfectly acceptable to keep your pedals level the whole way through, and you're not going to be tempted really, or it's not necessary to do any dipping or outside foot weighting?
A couple situations. One is where there's a lot of three-dimensional terrain underneath you, and you don't want to get your pedals caught up. Right. Either that, or where there's some banking to the turn, like a berm turn, where you just want to do like a really quick little turns. I would say the longer the radius of that turn, the more you're probably going to get outside pressure, just because you're going to feel the inertia of the turn.
Right.
And it's going to bring you either into a little bit of dipping or maybe even down to the bottom. Another situation is when you're in a berm turn where you want to just lean the bicycle down, and speed of the trail dictates that you really can't get enough speed to need to lean it past the angle of the berm.
Right.
So at that point, you're not really using any falling in. I mean, if you think about the arrows that we talked about before on a flatland turn, those arrows are pointing straight into the ground.
Right.
Now when I'm on a bank turn, I'm up on, and the arrows are now pointing into that bank turn.
Right. This is a turn with like fully enough support.
With
for you
enough
to lay
support for
into
the
it,
speed
right?
that the trail's taking you.
Yeah.
But beyond the point at which the bicycle, once the bicycle leans past the angle of the berm, I'm going to need to either get some hip flexion or create a little bit of outside pedal pressure, because think about what my arrows are doing. My arrows were pointing straight into the berm. Now they're going to start coming down here. They're going to start wanting to deflect off, and my tires are going to want to slide off.
Right.
So at that point, I'm going to want to get a little bit more pressure into my outside foot. And the other thing about that is, in order to lean the bicycle over, I'm probably going to have to dip a little bit just to bring that inside knee up and give myself something to fall in around. And that's going to really be my physical cue to kind of getting me into a turn like that
Right.
at greater speed.
So and so most of the berm turns, you're going to be pretty level with the bike, right? You're not going to be leaning the bike. You're going to be keeping the pedal or the bike level, so as to keep that downward pressure into the
That's exactly
face of the
right.
berm.
That's exactly right. And then at the point at which you get to that same angle as the bank of the turn, once you want to go beyond that, then you're going to start to lean the bike a little bit more, and the rider will look a little bit upright in relation to the bicycle, but will still be leaned at the angle of the berm.
Right.
Switchback turns are some of the most difficult turns for a lot of riders to negotiate, and there's kind of a reason for that that's a pretty simple explanation. A lot of people automatically tend toward the inside line on turns, and with the switchback turn, that's something you really want to stay away from. You need to remember that your bicycle is probably not going to turn sharply enough, especially if it's a long downhill bike. It's probably not going to turn sharply enough to make a really tight switchback turn. Cool thing about the way a downhill bike, or any bicycle works for that matter, is that if you roll a bicycle on the ground and turn the handlebars as tightly as you can, you'll notice that the front tire takes a really wide line around the turn, whereas the back tire is almost staying in a static position, kind of like a compass on a piece of paper. So knowing that, all I really need to do is guide my front wheel through the turn properly, and if my front wheel's made it through the turn, the back wheel's just going to follow, and it's going to roll over just about anything. So I'm going to pay particular attention to the line my front wheel takes, and to start going into a switchback turn, I'm generally going to try and ride kind of high into it, and then I'm going to try and commit or fall in to the turn to finish the turn out. Now, falling in is something we've touched on already, and it really becomes pretty obvious when you slow video down and you're watching switchback turns that falling in is one of the essential ingredients to a proper switchback turn when done at speed. When I talk about falling in, it's a leap of faith, just momentarily, where I'm making a turn and I know I want to turn back the other direction, so I'm going to turn my head, my shoulders, and then my hips, and then hopefully the bike's going to just be underneath me, and most of the time it's going to be. So we're going to come into the turn a little bit wide with the front wheel. Back tire is going to take its own line. It's going to find its own line on the inside, and we're just going to try and utilize that concept of falling in. In general, when we're coming toward a turn, we want to have really good brake modulation, meaning we don't want to create a skid. There are always going to be exceptions in mountain biking because terrain is so diverse. In some situations, it's okay to skid the back tire, at least on a closed racetrack. And those situations would typically be where I'm needing to set up the bicycle, needing to get it turned without creating too much pressure into the front wheel through the turn. So like in really dusty, dry, loamy conditions, sometimes I don't want to just hold a lot of pressure through the turn, really pressuring that outside foot, because I'm going to blow right through the turn. It's just going to plow me down into the dirt. So what I'm going to do instead in that situation is maybe grab a little bit of brake and create almost a false apex to the turn, a place where I don't necessarily have the most pressure into the turn like I do on a proper flatland turn where I have good traction, but instead just skidding the bike slightly, and then as I let off the brake and it catches traction, that is the apex. So there are times where we can actually create an apex to a turn that way. Counter-directional steering, it's something I'm premeditatively doing to create a better situation on my bicycle. With counter-steering, I'm just countering something that the bicycle is doing that I want to change. So on a flatland turn, a lot of times you may have felt, maybe especially on a 180-degree turn, if you're trying to make it through the turn, that your bike just kind of wants to find the edge of that turn and it doesn't want to turn. So one of the things we sometimes utilize when we're in that situation and trying to make the bike turn is we utilize a little bit of counter-directional steering. So basically, as I'm coming through a turn, if I'm turning left, instead of just thinking about pressuring down with my right hand, I might actually just give the slightest little bit of input to my left hand here, which drops me into the turn and allows me to go through and finish the turn. Now that's differentiated from counter steering. When I'm counter steering, I'm countering a slide. So if I'm on flat ground, coming through, making a nice turn, and my bicycle starts to slide, basically what's happening there is the front wheel is starting to slow down in relation to the ground. And eventually, if I don't do something to regain my front tire's speed, it's going to start to slow down, and tuck underneath me and cause me to just basically wash out in the turn. So I'm going to do something about that actively. I'm going to counter against that. So as I feel that front end starting to tuck, I'm actually just going to bring the bars around, and this is basically the beginning of a two-wheel drift. I'm going to bring the bars back a little bit and just allow that tire that's wanting to slow down and wanting to tuck, I'm going to allow it to just get back up to ground speed again. And as soon as it does, I can steer back into the turn some more. And that's really what a two-wheel drift it consists of, is me feeling that wheel starting to tuck and letting it drift, letting that speed back out a little bit, then pulling back into the turn, and then feeling that feeling again, and then just kind of working with that. And that's basically the essence of creating a good two-wheel drift.
I think oval track racing in the motorcycle world, you see those guys the whole time they're going around all the corners, they're pretty much in a two-wheel drift, because obviously they have the motor, and their back wheel is turning, but they have to keep their front wheel up to speed so they can make it out. And they're not even turning into the turn, they're turning out, but they're actually, turning the opposite direction that their front wheel is.
Exactly. It's a really effective technique, and crosses over into all kinds of two-wheel activities. I'm on a sport bike, a motorcycle that is, on pavement. I can lean the rider and the bicycle, right? Because I know that I have a nice round tire that's meant to stick to pavement. Hopefully the pavement doesn't have a big hole or rocks on it or something like that, and it's going to stick really nicely. In this situation though, I have a lot of undulations on the terrain, and I have a pretty narrow tire, and it's not really meant, it's got a lot of knobbies on it, it's not really meant for just me just leaning on a flat plane. So on a flatland turn on a bicycle, I'm actually going to lean the bicycle and not the rider.
Oh, really?
The rider can lean a little bit, but not very much. Remember when we were braking, we were talking about our directional forces, and that we wanted to basically press down the middle row of knobbies into the ground, right?
Okay.
So now that I'm going onto the edge row of knobbies, I want to press those into the ground. And if I was to lean my body over, what happens to my arrows? They go into the ground and kind of bounce up and diffract. They're not going straight into the ground. So here I would essentially still, if I was leaning my bicycle and my body, I would be trying to weight the middle row of knobbies, and they're not even on the ground. So what I want to do is I want to actually get up over my bicycle into a situation where I can weight that inside row of knobbies that's trying to bite. So in this situation here, again, I'm riding inside my body, my outside knee is bent. If I get too far to the end of my rope like this and my bike starts to slide, I'm going to have no recourse, right? So I want to stay down here where I have recourse to move the bicycle either direction, should it slip or should it hit a bump. And I want to be in a situation where I'm not only within my own human suspension, but I've compressed the bicycle. Notice how when I push down on my pedal and through the bottom bracket, using my hip and my foot to push down and through, I'm able to load both the front and rear suspension. And that's really important. A lot of times people have a tendency to come into turns and just kind of steer with their hands, and you have this feeling that your front end just wants to slide out on you. That's because you don't have enough pressure over the front wheel. In order to get that pressure over the front wheel, I need to not just think about turning with my hands, but think about turning with my foot and my hip. And that's where that pressure is going to come from, okay? So now, if I got this onto a berm turn, what would be the difference? Say we have a 45-degree angle. What can I now do with the rider? I can lean up to 45 degrees, that's right. And beyond that, I can lean the bicycle more if I want to go faster. When I come into a turn, if I just ride through a turn with my feet level, I'm essentially just following my bicycle through the turn and trying to turn with my hands. I'm behind my bicycle and I'm basically pushing it, and that's going to make the front tire really likely to wash out. There also is no definitive moment at which I've gone from going straight to making a turn. If I dip my outside foot though, and point my inside knee toward the inside apex of the turn, by pointing my inside knee, I start to rotate my head where I want to go, commit my shoulders where I want to go. But more importantly, I know that if I'm pointing my inside knee into the turn, even if my outside foot's not down at 6 o'clock, I've put all the pressure onto my outside foot. I cannot stand on this foot and simultaneously move my knee in. So it's a cue to get my weight onto my outside foot. It's also a cue by pointing at the inside apex of the turn to turn my head, turn my shoulders, and to start getting me turning toward that turn. Much better, good. You dipped that time, good. Good, now you're starting to dip, good. Excellent. Yes, perfect, money. Unfortunately for us, it doesn't end with a flatland turn. It ends getting really off camber. And this is going to become especially apparent now at the end of this turn. It's going to be really necessary for me to be coming through this turn. I'm leaning the rider a little bit because I'm on flatland, but not that much. I'm relatively upright. But then as I get down toward that off camber, I want to be sure that my bike continues to lean, but that the rider almost gets a little bit more upright, because what I'm actually trying to do is make sure that I'm maintaining those traction points. And as that heel slides away, what happens to our arrows? They are all actually coming in from the outside, right? Yeah, Tristan, nice, man. Big improvement. Good. Oh, your left elbow dropped that time, and it made you start to steer instead of having your knife edge that you had. So that's why you got a little bit wobbly there at the end. Make sure you keep that outside elbow nice and high, or at least up.
Elbow and
Drive that foot down. There you go. Good. The moment at which you made that turn, it really turned for you. You're just trying to find that spot. This is a difficult turn. Coming toward a turn that I'm going to brake for. I'm pedaling down toward that turn. When I decide to brake, I want to take that moment to put all my body weight and my active movement into the bicycle to create better braking. When I'm coming into a turn, I want to take all my body weight and set it into my outside pedal, set it into my hips, and set it into my tires all at one moment. I don't want all that energy just to kind of trickle down into my bicycle. I want to push it down into my bicycle and let my bicycle know I'm there to create control. When I'm about to go off a drop, there's that moment at which I go from standing neutrally to shifting back and creating hand pressure into my hands. It's very important at the edge of a drop that my moment is correct. I only have a brief amount of time that I'm going to be able to elevate that front end through the movement of my hips coming back and creating palm pressure into the handlebars. Again, that moment is very important. When I'm jumping and my bicycle is compressing into the lip of a jump ramp, I have a moment there where I can decide how much or how little I want to take from that jump. At the moment where my bicycle compresses, I can take that moment and pop that front tire off the lip, pop that back tire off the lip, and go for big air. Or right at the moment that I know all that compression is building up, I can release and erase that moment and get through that moment. Probably one of the most useful and most used or most necessary techniques anyway on modern trails is being able to drop, being able to go off a drop without dumping your front end down it and flipping over the handlebars or something. And really drops come down to timing, and there are a number of different ways to hit drops. With correct basic form, rider pretty much stands neutrally in the rider compartment until just before he or she wants to elevate the front end off a drop, at which point the rider just tips back onto the heels to create tension into the palms of the hands right at the time that you're about to go off the drop, and that elevates the front end just briefly to go off the drop.
When you're approaching the edge of the drop, you don't want to get back on your bike to go off the end, because that's probably going to slingshot you over the handlebars. The timing part that comes in is the premeditation of just letting your bike roll off the end, and you creating that lift with the pressure, like Simon described, on the front of your hands and dipping your heels. And probably the most important thing is the timing of those.
Certainly. Like Lars said, if we just simply got back way before the drop and we missed our moment, we'd come off that drop, our body would be pretty stationary, and the bicycle would want to rotate around that stationary body. So what we want to actually do is we want to wait until we're just about to drop off the drop, and as the front tire is coming off, we're shifting back, and at the point at which my back tire is on the edge of the drop, my hips should be the furthest back that they're going to go in that motion at that very moment, and that's going to allow me to continue to elevate that front end until it falls, and then I rejoin on top of the bicycle. And that brings up another important point about this having to do with speed. The faster I'm going, the less I'm going to have to shift back into my hips or fall back onto my heels to create the amount of tension that I need. If I'm moving very slowly, the effective amount of time it takes to do that drop is greater because I'm rolling slowly. It's going to take longer to do that, and I have less force moving down the trail. So I'm going to have to really move back quickly into my hips and really get a lot of force in that to actually elevate the front end. Whereas if I'm cruising down the trail at 30 miles an hour, I can almost just ride off a drop without doing anything except for maybe just tipping back onto my heels a little bit. With racer style, we're basically trying to create a situation where we're moving gradually from our point of takeoff. We're moving directly and gradually toward the landing on a diagonally linear plane like this. With correct basic form, we've come off the drop and we've kind of dropped. With racer style, what we're going to try and do is make our helmet come from the normal takeoff point all the way on a linear line, all the way down to our landing, which is going to create the smallest possible drop and the smoothest possible drop and the smoothest possible landing. And that's going to be basically done by soaking down into our bicycle off the lip of the drop, at which point we can just unhinge our legs and find the landing. So
Right about here, I start moving down into it, like that. So that all I'm doing now is letting out my own safety gear, my own landing gear. So my helmet's taken a much more direct path. It hasn't just come off the drop and dropped down. It's coming down a diagonal line and bringing me down to where I'm going to be. The other thing I've achieved from that is because I've gone from tall to small coming down this thing, I was super tall right here. Now I've moved in a situation here on the edge. If you took a picture of me here, I'm going to be fairly small. Now all I have to do is, as my bike comes off this, is extend my feet. I'm no longer just an object on top of my bike that's just going to land on my bike. I'm the one placing it down where I want it.
however much I can absorb into my body, which for me, being tall, is quite a bit, I can erase that amount off the height of the drop, effectively making my landing a lot softer and keeping me moving more quickly down the trail upon landing.
The faster you go, the timing, like you said, the timing is going to be a little bit, it's just as important. It's just going to be a little bit sooner. Like you're approaching the lip of the jump, the lip of the drop, and as we said earlier, you're trying to achieve, land on the same landing, and by doing so, you want to do that pre-compression, go from standing tall to minimizing your height at the edge of the drop, and still utilizing the same technique by tipping your heels and applying pressure to the front of your bars without pulling, and that's going to allow you to land in the same place off the same drop at a faster speed.
So far we've talked about a couple different ways to drop, and both of those have really, with both of those we've been talking about decreasing the effect of the size of the drop on us and really just trying to land on the transition as high up as we can so we don't end up flat bottoming or going too far. Another way to do this is to take off earlier, and in order to do that we pretty much are pre-jumping, and with the pre-jump we're essentially J-hopping before takeoff. We might look for a small trail feature, a little rise in the ground, maybe a rock or a little root or something we can feature off, and then utilize that to create a little J-hop and get us up over the edge of the drop so that the point at which we're coming down off the drop, we're actually moving toward our landing already, when normally we would have just been going off the drop at that point. Here we are already on our way down, ready to meet the landing at speed.
Yeah. Basically, the only time you want to utilize this technique is when you're going fast enough that there's nothing you can physically do to prevent you from landing past the landing. And basically what you're doing, like Simon said, you're J-hopping before the edge of the drop, and you're effectively shortening the distance of your travel off the end of the drop by however far you jump before the edge. So say you J-hop 3 feet before the edge of the jump, you're already on your downward travel with the bike in the air towards the landing right at the edge of the drop.
So definitely an advanced technique, something you want to learn on a small drop with something of lower consequence, somewhere where you're really comfortable. And obviously, the fear most people have with doing this is that they're going to tap their back tire good and hard on the edge of the drop and have some issues. Most of the time with modern suspension bikes, especially with long travel bikes, it's not too much of an issue because the first couple inches of travel is fairly soft. So if we tap a little with the back end, it's not too bad.
Yeah.
But if you catch a lot of contact, or if you're on a less forgiving bicycle, maybe a hardtail, and you catch that contact pre-jumping off a drop, it can definitely create some problems.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't recommend this to anybody under a certain skill level, but something to strive for sure.
And something to watch your favorite riders do on video. Let's talk for a minute about hitting a drop on steep terrain. We've already talked about letting the bicycle dictate where we are on steep terrain. So if I'm rolling down something steep, my bicycle is going to have moved just in front of me. That's going to put me a little bit over the back of the bicycle. What's going to happen now if I want to hit a drop? We've talked about the fact that I need to be able to move toward the back of the cockpit in order to create the energy necessary to lift the front end. In this situation, because I'm on a steep hill and I'm toward the back of the bike, I'm going to have to move forward back into the bicycle and stand over my pedals and stand into the hill to give myself a place to move to create the energy I need to elevate the front end. Now, if there are multiple drops, I'm just going to repeat that process. I'm going to stand into that first drop. As soon as I'm about to go off it, I'm going to slide back, create the tension in my palms I need, make that drop, let my bike jockey and do what it needs to do, move back forward into it, and do that process again. And that's what's necessary for dropping on steep terrain. I need to reload the gun every time I shoot it.
If I want to drop this properly, I have to create some motivation. And there's a lot of things written that say push down on your fork or pull up with your hands. Either one of those things is going to take us away from what we're trying to do, which is to go down. If I push down and load my fork, it's going to bring me back up, and then I come down. If I pull up, I got to go up before I come down. I want to go down. For a basic drop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift back into my hips and create a longer line effectively between my hands and my hips, which is going to create an invisible line of tension that's going to cause that front end to carry for just a second. So I need to stand in the middle of the rider compartment, give myself a place to go, and as my front tire is about to roll off the edge, I shift back to the point where when my back tire is on the edge of the drop, I'm at my furthest point back, then I simply just let the bike fall underneath me, and I just come down and land on top. So just for a second, I'm going to be brave, and I'm going to stand and match the pitch of the hill, effectively loading that gun that I need to fire, right? So now I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to have a place to move. If I shifted my hips back too soon here, and then the bike came toward this drop, that's going to counteract by having my hips too far back, and it's going to make the front end dive and make my heels come over, right?
Got it.
So I just want to be nice and patient and just relax, let all that weight shift down into my feet, and just relax, move down toward it, and then right at the edge, make my nice movement and rejoin the bike. So what you're doing is you're back here a little bit, and you're moving down a little bit, but you're still keeping it moving. You're not stopping midway, so it's good. But your arc is a little bit flat down here, and then it drops down. As you move down here, you kind of got to the end of your movement here a little bit, so you firmed up here a little bit, and that shot you a little bit further. If you had just started a little later with your move, so that you were a little bit in more of a pliable, soft state right here, then your feet would unfold more easily. As you're moving through your squat, think about squatting here and not squatting here so much. It looked really good. I mean, really, what's going to get you all the way to the bottom is just repeating this over and over.
When a rider rides off fours, it means that he or she has pulled from both the hands and the feet simultaneously, creating kind of a rigid rider and a unified package that's kind of at the mercy of the terrain. We want to make sure that we lead with our hands and follow with our feet to enable our body to open up, free up, and be as athletic as possible. If I bunny hop incorrectly, I'm pulling from my hands and my feet simultaneously. This is the same sort of motion you might see that rider make off a jump that might create catastrophe in the air. When I ride off fours, my body is essentially static. And when I come up off a jump, I better have done it right because everything is going to rotate around my static body. So if I'm slightly crooked, I'm going to continue to list in the air. If I'm come up and I'm slightly nose heavy, I'm going to continue to list in the air. Very important that my hands and my feet are constantly moving independently. It's one of the biggest things that separates riders at all levels. Very advanced riders will always lead with their hands and follow with their feet, whether they're J-hopping, jumping, turning, or whatever they might be doing. They're leading with their hands and following with their feet, allowing for recourse again.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about jumping. Jumping can be one of the most difficult techniques to learn, but one of the most rewarding to enjoy.
When we're taking off a jump, we want to be sure that we contact the lip of the jump with both the front and the rear wheel. This is going to give us the proper altitude, distance, and it's also going to set our bicycle up correctly for a nice transition on the landing. So as I'm rolling up the face of the jump, my front tire is going to unload right here off the lip of the jump. It's going to continue on up. Back tire is going to hit the lip of the jump. That lip is going to give me the altitude I want and the distance I want, but additionally, it's going to give me that kick I need to get into the proper transition for my landing. When we're landing, we're gonna do a very similar thing. We talked about our correct takeoff, front wheel first, then back wheel, getting the full benefit of the lip. That's gonna kick us into a nice flight arc, at the top of which we're gonna start to come back down again. And we're gonna look for our landing in the same way. Our front tire is gonna land first, and then our back tire comes down in the same place, not at the same time. If I come down all at once, all at the same time, that can be okay in some situations, but in general, I wanna make sure I lead with the front wheel and gain control of my bicycle as soon as possible. That is, as soon as the front wheel contacts the ground. I'm also gonna be setting myself up for a slightly softer landing because I can use shorter transitions if I only go one wheel at a time. If I go both wheels at the same time, I'm required to land on something at least the length of my bicycle. One of the more basic aspects of jumping really is the difference between being active and being passive into the face of a jump. In general, I as a rider have control over how much air I get off a jump at a given speed based on how much foot pressure I put into the face of that jump, how much I let my potential energy really manifest itself into the face of the jump and create a lot of air for me. But within that, being passive, there are a lot of different techniques for passively hitting a jump and blowing off speeds. So Lars, I mean, when you're racing, obviously it's a lot different than when you're just messing around off a jump. I mean, if you're just out at your local flow park or something and you're just kind of cruising down a run, the way your feet interact with the ramp of the jump is definitely different than when you're racing at full speed.
Yeah,
Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that ultimately what it really comes down to is what you're looking at is your speed of approaching the jump is going to dictate the technique that you're going to want to use, and also the altitude that you want to achieve over the double. If you're wanting to get higher altitude and coming in at a bit slower speed, you're going to want to stand in a bit more into the face so you create compression, even if you're on a hardtail, which is going to preload you basically for the lip and that altitude. And ultimately what it comes down to is what you're doing off the lip is the same technique as bunny hopping up a curb or over a log in the trail or something. You're basically just bunny hopping off the lip, and that's what gives you that compression and spring off of the lip. And the faster you go at approaching the same jump, you're also going to need to change your technique to make sure you don't over jump it. If you're going twice as fast at the jump, you're going to need to do nearly the opposite, which is approach the lip at a higher standpoint on your bike and compress a bit later into the lip. So as opposed to compressing at the base of the transition and then springing off the top, you're going to want to approach standing and then compress into the lip. So it's going to push you through and hold you down.
We've talked a lot about leading with our hands, following with our feet, and creating a situation where we ride off twos. And really, I can't think of a more important place to make sure you follow those rules than when you're jumping.
Yeah.
Probably the most dangerous place you could get caught up off fours is off a jump. Being square off a jump, everybody's done it. It's no fun. Land sideways or something, and you're in trouble. One of the benefits of riding off twos, if I do get into a situation where I'm leading properly with my hands and I feel like my feet are truly following my hands, is that I'm able to start to break my body into two parts really off a jump and able to do what we call counter-directional steering, which is just setting ourselves up to make a turn basically in the air or for a turn that's happening as we land. So basically the idea behind counter-directional steering is that when I go up into the air, if say I'm turning left, then I'm going to turn my handlebars to the right in the air, and that's going to commit my body down toward the left, down toward the jump landing, and then I'm going to turn back into it. I think it's probably the most utilized technique really in jumping, just in terms of jumps and drops and things where you're just getting that slight bit of counter-directional steering to get your body going where you want to go.
Yeah, I agree. And it's almost, until you start to do it, it's almost kind of opposite of what you would think, how you would think it would work. But it's really natural the way it works. If you're, like you said, if you're turning to the right, you just turn your handlebars to the left a little bit, and this could be in a situation where you actually have to turn in the air, or you want to be turning upon landing. It's going to set you up for both.
Yeah.
And you just turn the opposite direction, and that actually drops your inside shoulder and it pretty much will do it all for you.
Yeah,
It falls into
yeah.
place pretty well.
Yeah, a great way to get started with that is if you're just looking to introduce a little bit of flow and a little bit of style to your jumping, find a jump that you're really comfortable with. Maybe one that doesn't have a turn of any consequence after it. Maybe you set up some cones or put some rocks out and kind of make a pretend turn that you're going to hit when you land. And to start off with in the air, the first thing, actually before you even get to a turn, even a mock turn following a jump, the first thing you want to do is just go up in the air and just turn your handlebars a little bit and just start getting comfortable. One of the most dangerous things to do in the air really is absolutely nothing. If we completely stop, we become very stationary, and it's almost like riding off fours. Even if we're led with our hands properly, eventually things are going to get kind of frozen up in the air, and we're going to rotate around the most stationary part of our body. Any part that stopped maybe a little bit incorrectly or something, everything's going to continue to rotate around that.
It's kind of like being caught in the wind almost.
It is. It's that same sort of feeling, and then maybe find something of more consequence or something where the trail actually turns.
Or a
And
hip jump or something.
Hip jumps are a great way to learn
Yeah.
that technique. That's because you're already turning on takeoff. So the takeoff sets you up. You don't have to just create a turn on the lip of an otherwise straight jump. The turn or the takeoff actually has you turning naturally anyway. So it sets you up nicely for that.
Yeah. Counterdirectional steering also leads into many other tricks and types of riding. I mean, it's just going to open doors for you. I mean, that's probably the best way to learn how to do a tabletop is to
Yeah.
do
Yeah, tabletops pretty much comes from the same thing. I mean, when we're tabletopping, just going to basically counter-directional steer, and then at the end of that, just exaggerate a little bit by bringing our feet up a little bit and maybe forcing the handlebars down a little bit more.
Yeah, to bring that into a tabletop is probably one of the most natural tricks you can learn how to do. Once you get the counter-directional steering down and you get a bit more comfortable with it, you're going to start leaning in to that turn a little bit more. It's almost kind of like trying to jump a bit higher than you want to be going, and then you instead of taking that full altitude, you just let your bike come up into you, and you exaggerate those movements. You push down on your outside hand, roll the wrist, and then just suck your feet up. And I mean that it'll pretty much turn into a tabletop on its own the more you do
I
it.
think this is something that less advanced riders probably watch on film, and maybe you watch your favorite riders in a mountain cross race or something like that, and you think, man, why is he throwing tricks during this race? Well, obviously there's some people out there who are trying to throw style, but in general, style leads to control, and really different riders have different styles, and they may look like they're showboating a little bit, but really what they're doing is utilizing counter-directional steering and these other things we're talking about to actually create control, ground control and air control, and it's just so beautiful looking that you think it must be for fun.
You get to a certain point where you can only do so much with your body weight. You need to start losing some energy somewhere. So the scrub, I mean, that's exactly what Bubba's doing when he races moto. Is he has so much speed and energy in that dirt bike that he wants to keep it on the ground to get back on the gas, and he can stay 3 feet off the lip of the jump and across the tabletop and down.
That brings up a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Even with counter-directional steering, which we just talked about, sometimes counter-directional steering can be used for the same thing. When you're getting up toward the face of the top of a jump, rather than letting that compression that you've built up into the suspension, rather than letting it push you up, you can kind of blow it off to the side. And with the scrub, you're effectively just turning down into the jump and really trying to do the same thing, trying to get that loaded fork to just pop off the back of the jump so that it's not popping off and pushing you up higher into the air.
Counter-directional steer basically into the lip of a jump, and your timing will just be a little bit early. So you're not jumping and then doing the turn in the air. You almost start to do it off the lip, and that's what's going to get you to create that low flight arc and get your bike to go to the side. Basically what you're doing is an outside corner turn off the lip of the jump, and that allows you to blow the suspension off the side, stay a bit low, and then you land basically as you would doing any other tabletop or whip or something. The main difference between a squash and a scrub would be the vertical plane of your bike, and I mean, this is getting a bit technical here. So I mean, you could call, I think,
It's almost interchangeable.
yeah,
really.
almost interchangeable, but I think like just a direct squash is the action that you're taking with your body to lose the rebound of your suspension off the lip and not create that into to airtime. And being a shorter rider, I find that the only way that I'm really able to achieve that while at speed is because I get to the point where I can only compress so far, and then my butt is on my saddle, so I have to go somewhere, and I'm going off the back. So I approach the lip, and I compress as much as I can into the face and off the lip of the jump, and then I have to go to the back basically. And I find that like I get my butt like almost to the top of my back tire, and that allows my bike to come up into me, and I'm with my body weight, I'm offsetting the force of my rebound into the air, and that'll probably save like half of the distance of airtime that I would normally get, and then that is gonna push your bike off to the front of you, and you just really just need to pull yourself back onto the front to get back into the position to where you're landing down the transition of the line.
That's a great example of one time where, even as an advanced rider, Lars is purposefully going to the end of his rope. He's dragging himself off the back. He's at the end of his rope. Now the rope's going to pull him back onto the bicycle. So it's not always bad to be at the end of your rope, but the moments should be brief and they should be there to help you. So we've talked about different ways of controlling our flight arc over jumps, and really what we've been talking about here is ways to hit jumps at speed for the most part. I mean, if we don't have enough speed, that's easier for us to address. That's just creating compression into the lip of a jump. But these techniques we've talked about, being passive or creating a scrub or creating a squash, these are all techniques for not going as far. And to just really basically outline the differences, it all has to do with the vertical or the linear kind of plane. So if I'm going passive into a jump and I'm just going to soak that bicycle and it's going to be really close to me in the air and I'm trying not to get air, I'm thinking on a vertical plane here, that the bike's coming up into me, I'm going to soak it as far as I can and try not to let that energy push my body up any higher. Now when we get into things like counter-directional steering or throwing a scrub or squashing or doing something like that, what we're really doing is we're introducing that horizontal plane so that we're not just blowing the energy off up into our bodies. We still are, but additionally we're adding that additional plane where we're able to throw some of that energy out off the lip of the jump off to one of the sides and not just have to have it all absorb up underneath ourselves.
Yeah, I think that the vertical and horizontal plane is a good key to describe the differences between, say, like even just a squash, where you're just sucking it up, and say a scrub is to where you're gonna push off the side of a jump, and the rebound is either coming up into you or the rebound is coming away from you on a vertical plane, or it's coming away from you on a semi-horizontal plane.
Yeah, definitely the top riders are utilizing all both those extremes and everything in between in their riding. And really what we're going to talk about today are more advanced techniques to blow off energy from your bike. We're going to talk a little bit about blowing off energy on a vertical plane, but then we're going to get to some more advanced techniques where we talk more about blowing energy off on a horizontal plane and letting energy go out the side of your bike. This is going to be helpful for when you're racing and you want to get back on the ground, or if you're out free riding and maybe you're hitting a section pretty fast to get into another section, maybe to clear a jump or something like that, allow you to carry your speed through sections smoothly. Whether or not some of this riding you see today is over your head, it doesn't really matter. We can apply some of these same basic principles to any kind of riding, really. So Jerry, one of the things you just talked about was starting to link trail sections together. And one of the ideas that we want to work on today is being able to move the bike in a way that allows us to get into the next section really well. And one of the concepts we want to talk about and really kind of work out today is the idea of riding off twos. And what I mean by that is I'm going to lead with my hands and follow with my feet. And I don't want to get too caught all at once off a jump. I want to be able to divide those things because I want to be able to get my front wheel back down into the terrain and move on to the next thing.
As I'm approaching the lip, I absorb the jump up into my hands, I'm letting the handlebars of my bike come up into me, and as I release off the lip, I extend my arms so you create a forward momentum and flight arc as opposed to an upward coming off the lip as a full scoop.
Nice and soft.
You're looking really good off this jump, but what I want to get you doing is landing a little more softly and starting to really think about landing with both tires in the same place and not at the same time. And you're right in between that. You're not quite landing with both tires at the same time, but your front tire is getting out of the transition and your back tire is just hooking up a little bit on the top. The other thing is I want you to go into a position where you're softening your feet just a little bit on the landing. Your feet are still a little bit firm from takeoff. And what that's causing is a little bit of feedback into your bicycle in a moment where you're compressing, rebounding, and then having to regain control of the bike.
So you're riding up, you're approaching the lip, and you absorb the lip up into you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you're doing off the face.
Okay.
And then as you come off, you rebound.
Okay.
And so you go from here and then to there.
Okay. Just
You see
right
what I'm
at the
saying?
left.
That's the movement.
Okay.
And that's what's going to break your jump up from 4s
Yeah.
into 2s.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And we're not trying to get you at the end of your rope, but because I guarantee you when you try this, you're not going to get back here the first time. You
Yeah.
know what I'm saying? But that's the motion that you want to be doing.
Okay.
You have a lot more range in your body movement on your bike than you feel like you do.
And one of the things that we do with people sometimes is like just get people on the ground to start doing things where they feel leverage and just start moving around on your bike and just start playing with it side to side or whatever, and just seeing how far you can move your bike and that it's okay to be here and it's okay to be here.
Yeah.
And right now you're standing a little bit centrally over your bike, and that's creating a lot of compression into it, and it's making it really hard to let the energy escape from underneath you. So Jerry, on that last jump, I noticed you were starting to get some good movement with your bike, starting to blow that energy off to the side and get some good counter-directional steering. And the way we were setting up for the turn, we were kind of throwing a little bit of a whip almost, just to kind of set up. But that same kind of activity we did there can be used to create a tabletop. If you think about it, what you're really doing on a tabletop is compressing into the jump, and then as you counter-directional steer sideways, you're letting that energy come up and bring that bike flat up underneath you. So some of these tricks we're learning for technique today are also going to be tricks we can use for style. And really, for being passive and letting energy blow through us, a squash is probably going to be something you're actually going to use more frequently coming down the trail. And that's going to be a technique where we're going to scoot a little bit off the back of the bike instead of just being passive and letting the bike move toward us. At some point, the bike is going to hit into us. It can only move so far. So at that point, we're going to release it out a little bit in front of us. And it's going to be a very effective tool for changing our flight pattern and minimizing our flight arc and staying low over a jump. Now what I want to do is combine the other elements that Lars was touching on earlier, which is moving around a little bit on your bicycle. So we've gone from being somewhat static over the bicycle and riding off 4s a little bit and getting quite a bit of air here to now really starting to get subtle with the lip and absorb some of it. Now what we want to do is work our angles, the angles of the terrain. We're turning a little bit coming into this jump, and it turns a little bit on landing. So I can start to play with that and let some of that energy not just escape up through my body, but let it escape in other ways on my bicycle, because this is a dynamic moment and my body is moving at this time. So I want to utilize that movement to blow that energy off in other directions. That was really good. You're starting to utilize the angles of the trail to deflect some of that energy. That looked really good. So I want you to just kind of keep playing around with this. Like Lars says, find a place you're comfortable with and just play around with that energy. Don't do anything too crazy, but just start to let that energy find ways to dissipate without shooting the rider up into the air. Okay. So Jerry, we've been working on counter-directional steering, talking about how that lends into really blowing off energy and that sort of thing, but it has another use on the trail. And we're going to talk about that right here. Basically what we have here is a small jump followed by a left-hand turn. So we can use cones to kind of make the section more and more difficult to get into, so that you're required to take more and more of a turn in order to get into the section. So here what we're going to be doing is actually throwing our counter-directional steering to the right to help us initiate a left-hand turn down off this jump and into the gully here. Now we're going to talk about this jump in a more basic way. We're just going to talk about hitting it straight, and we're going to even go further with the idea of being active. What we talked about before with being active was firming our feet up and letting that jump build compression into our human suspension and into our bicycle suspension, and then releasing that. Well, there's going to be times coming down the trail, maybe I make a mistake, or I need to jump high to get up something, and maybe I'm going a little slowly for the jump, and I really need to get extra active off it. In that rare instance, it's going to be totally fine to basically simulate a J-hop up off the top of a jump, just to get that quick height and that nice flight arc that I'm looking for, to get absolute maximum out of the jump possible. So this wouldn't be something that we would do if we were coming into a jump too fast or something like that. It's only something to really accentuate a jump at low speed. Okay. So we're going to basically be mimicking a J-hop here. Let's talk for a minute about manuals. Manuals are more than just a great way to show your style. Manuals are very useful on the trail as well. They can get us through a rock garden or through a ditch with speed. So how do we manual? We want to tip back onto our heels, and we want to create pressure into the palms of our hands. We're going to envision an invisible line between our hands and our hips. And as I tip my heels back into the bicycle, I'm going to create tension on this invisible line between my hands and my hips. And it's that tension that's going to allow the front wheel to lift. Notice that if I sit on my bicycle here and I just shift my hips back, I'm not going to grab underneath the grips. So I'm going suicide grip here. If I just shift my weight back, what happens? The bike comes up. As I move back in relation to the bicycle and I get not quite to the end of my rope, but to where my elbows are almost locked out, and I just leave them at that precise place on each side, that's going to create tension. It's going to allow that front end to lift. Let's spend some time talking about J-hopping and how it differs from bunny hopping. With the traditional bunny hop, the rider pulls with his hands and feet all at the same time, making his bicycle lift off the ground all at once. This is problematic for several reasons. The main reason is that we always want to lead with our hands and follow with our feet, keeping our bodies riding off twos and not riding off fours. Riding off fours causes me to dead sailor in the air or become stiff and start to drift maybe in a direction that I don't want to go. Let's talk about why bunny hopping doesn't work so well for getting over terrain. With the traditional bunny hop, if I pulled up on the whole bicycle all at once, I'm going to have to jump the entire distance leading up to the obstacle I want to clear. In order to land, I'm going to have to land almost a full bike length away in terms of where my front tire contacts the ground. This is going to make it hard to regain control in time to take a turn directly after an obstacle that I've tried to clear. With J-hopping, I lead with my hands and follow with my feet. As I approach the terrain, my front end comes up first. Now I don't have to jump the entire distance of my whole bicycle. From here, the rider simply extends his hands forward and the bike comes over the terrain piece in the air. Now my front tire comes into contact with the ground much more quickly and has a much shorter flight arc. This allows the rider to begin turning and gaining control directly upon landing, allowing him or her to get into more technical terrain more easily. I come down the trail standing tall. When I'm getting close to the feature I want to J-hop, I do compress the bike slightly, at which point I actually go into a little bit of a manual and pull the front wheel off the ground first and then the back wheel off the ground. So we're going to be leading with our hands, following with our feet, riding off twos, and creating recourse or the ability to turn or do something different during our technique than we might have otherwise planned. So let's take a look at this for a minute. If I'm trying to jump over this log here that's underneath me correctly, what I want to do as I head toward it is load my bicycle in a little bit, lift the front end off the ground, get my front end to clear that log, and then at the moment that my back tire is about to actually strike it, I'm going to push forward slightly on the handlebars, and that's going to create lift into the back end and get me over that terrain piece correctly. Just to take a look and see how that works, let's just do something without my thumbs underneath the handlebars here. Watch what happens to the back tire when I push the front tire forward. Notice that the front tire is about a foot off the ground here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to push forward with my palms now. My thumbs are not underneath the handlebars, and we're going to take a look and see what happens to the back wheel. So from here, I'm going to simply push forward.
Notice that the back wheel's height matches the height of the front wheel. We've given you a lot to think about with these terms we've just talked about. The moment, riding off fours, being at the end of your rope. What does this all mean really? Well, it means that you can have a look at what you're doing when you're riding. If you're riding with a buddy, maybe you can help them out. But we don't want to overthink everything while we're riding. We do want to practice correctly, however. So when you're practicing, try to think about the correct body position on the bicycle. But when you get to real terrain, in a race or on big terrain, just try and do what you know. It should become instinctual. One of the biggest things about our brain is it has an uncanny ability to help us want to survive. And a lot of the reason that we sometimes get to the end of our rope off a jump is that our body is, or our brain is trying to protect our body. So it's telling us, don't go too high in the air, don't load your bicycle into this jump, get back on the ground. So to start off with, when you're just trying to get learning with some of these advanced techniques, your brain is going to kind of fool your body into doing the things it doesn't want to do. But what you need to remember is that as soon as your brain knows that it's safer to load into the front of a jump in order to clear that 20-foot double and catch proper backside, your brain is going to tell your body to do it. So for a while, you're going to have to train your brain to tell your body that something it previously thought was dangerous is now the safer alternative.